Around 2 a.m., I finally heard the sound of her key in the door. I stood up from the couch, trying to keep the concern off my face, but the sight of her stopped me cold. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a little wild, and her eyes were glassy. She looked like she'd had one too many, and while Jess could hold her liquor, this was different. I reached out to help her, but she waved me off, teetering into the living room, laughing under her breath, almost nervously. "How was it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, neutral. "It was fine," she said, a weird half smile on her face. She wouldn't look at me, her eyes darting around the room, focusing on anything but me. We sorted some stuff out. It was intense, but we're good now. Her words felt hollow, like she was reading from a script. She was avoiding me, brushing off the whole thing like it was no big deal. But something in her tone, her posture, it all felt off. Part of me wanted to push, to ask why she looked like she'd been through a war, why she was skirting around what really happened that night. But I didn't. I let it slide, convincing myself it was just one strange night, something she'd eventually open up about once she'd had a chance to sleep it off. So I helped her to bed, ignoring the uneasy feeling gnawing at me, and told myself everything would be clearer in the morning. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of her stumbling through the door, her face flushed, her laughter tinged with something darker, something she wasn't ready to share. It was the beginning of an unraveling, a crack in the foundation that would lead to everything I thought I knew, coming undone. Over the next few days, Jess carried on like everything was fine, like the last few months hadn't been a slow unraveling between her and Emily, capped off by whatever went down that night. She acted like nothing was wrong, but the signs were there if you looked close enough. I started noticing small things, the way she'd go quiet when her phone buzzed, how she'd suddenly leave the room to take a call or drop her voice to a whisper. Every time I caught her doing it, she'd brush it off with a nervous smile, claiming it was just work or something not important. But it felt important. One evening, I came home from work to find her sitting on the couch, staring off into space. She had this look in her eyes, far away, like she was somewhere else entirely. When she saw me, she flinched a bit, forced a smile, and tried to play it cool, but the effort was painfully obvious. I sat down next to her, hoping I'd finally get a straight answer if I approached it gently. "So," I began, keeping my tone light, "are you going to tell me what's been going on with you and Emily?" She looked at me, her smile fading, replaced by a look I hadn't seen before, something between guilt and dread. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "Come on, Jess. You've been on edge for weeks. That night out with her, you still haven't told me what happened." I tried to keep my voice calm, steady, but I could feel my frustration creeping in. I wanted answers. I needed them. She sighed, rubbing her hands together, avoiding my gaze. "It's complicated, okay? Things got a little heated that night. Emily and we had a fight, and it got out of hand." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. She wasn't telling me everything, and I could feel it in my gut. "And then," I prompted, trying not to let my impatience show. "And then," she trailed off, hesitating. "We ended up at another bar, met some people. It was messy." She let out a nervous laugh, one that sounded far from genuine. "I had too much to drink, and Emily was pissed, and one thing led to another. I just don't want to talk about it, okay?" The vagueness, the brushing off, it was like trying to nail jelly to a wall. I could feel the weight of something unspoken between us, a heavy silence that didn't belong. But I let it drop, telling myself I'd push later, when she was ready. After all, I trusted her, didn't I? Except that trust was starting to feel shakier by the day. The following weekend, Emily came over for dinner, acting like nothing had happened, like she and Jess hadn't been at each other's throats. They laughed together, the same easy laughs they used to share, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something forced about it. I'd catch Emily giving Jess a look, a strange, knowing look, when they thought I wasn't watching, like they were sharing a secret, one I wasn't part of. After dinner, Emily pulled me aside, trying to make small talk, but I couldn't resist pressing a bit, trying to figure out what had really happened between them that night. "So," I said, keeping my tone casual, "you and Jess good now? Seemed like you had a bit of a falling out." Emily hesitated, her smile faltering for a second. "Oh yeah," she said, too quickly. "It was nothing, really, just one of those things, you know? Best friends fighting over stupid stuff." Her voice was too bright, her laugh a little too sharp. I felt a flicker of anger, a hint of suspicion creeping in. "Did you two do anything you regret?" Her eyes widened, just for a second, before she forced her smile back into place. "Why would you ask that?" she replied, her voice a touch too casual. "I mean, we might have gotten a little wild, sure, but it's nothing serious." I watched her, trying to read her face, her body language, searching for the lie hidden behind her words, but she was good, deflecting my questions with ease. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being kept in the dark about something bigger. That night, when Emily left, I decided I couldn't just let it go anymore. Jess was quiet, avoiding my eyes, and I knew I had to confront her. I sat her down, forcing her to look at me, her face filled with a mix of reluctance and guilt. "Jess," I began, my voice steady but cold, "I know something happened that night, and I need you to tell me the truth. No more evasions, no more half answers." Her face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears, and she finally broke down, her words spilling out in a jumbled confession. She told me about how after the fight, they'd gone to another bar to cool off, how they'd met a guy there, a random stranger, how one drink had turned into too many, and in a haze of frustration, alcohol and spite, they'd let the night spiral out of control. I could barely process what she was saying. Jess was speaking quickly, almost desperate to get it all out, her voice thick with shame. "It was stupid," she whispered, looking away. We both made a horrible mistake. I don't even know how it happened. It's all a blur." She told me how, in the dim light of that bar, after a few reckless rounds of shots, the three of them had ended up tangled in a mess that neither of them had planned or wanted, but had somehow fallen into. The words tumbled out of her, raw and filled with regret, but the damage was done. My stomach twisted, the sick realization settling in as I tried to process what she'd just admitted. When she finished, silence filled the room, a thick, suffocating silence. She looked at me, her face pale, her eyes red from crying, waiting for my reaction. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like the ground had shifted under me, like the foundation of everything I thought I knew had been ripped away, leaving me standing on nothing but empty air. Jess reached out, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what came over me. It was just a stupid, terrible mistake. I can't believe I let it happen." But her apology, sincere as it was, barely registered. All I could think about was the image she'd painted, the betrayal, the recklessness, the casual destruction of everything we'd built, and the knowledge that it had happened not because she didn't love me, but because of something twisted and impulsive, something I couldn't fully understand. I stood up, unable to stay in that room, needing air, space, anything but the suffocating weight of what I'd just learned. I grabbed my keys and left, her voice echoing after me, pleading, apologizing, trying to explain what couldn't be explained. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing my head, but leaving me reeling. I drove without any direction, my mind racing, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other. And as I drove, the reality of it all settled in. The knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again, that this was a wound that might never heal, a truth I'd never be able to forget. The shore had always been a place of calm for me, a refuge. On quiet days, I'd walk down to the beach, let the wind off the water blow through me, cleansing my mind, washing away the stress. But tonight, the waves felt like they were mocking me, crashing against the rocks in furious rhythm, as if they, too, were part of some cosmic betrayal. I'd driven here straight from the house after Jess's confession. I couldn't stand to be near her, the walls of our home closing in like a trap, stifling me with memories of the life we'd built, now shattered. All I wanted was to be somewhere open, somewhere the anger and the hurt could breathe. I thought I was alone out here, standing on the cold sand with the ocean stretched out endlessly before me. But then I heard her footsteps, slow, hesitant at first, crunching on the gravel path that led from the parking lot to the beach. I turned, and there she was, silhouetted in the moonlight, her face pale against the darkness. She'd followed me, somehow knowing where I'd be. "What are you doing here?" I asked, the edge in my voice barely restrained. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to be reminded of the things she'd told me just hours before. "I had to come," she said, her voice barely audible above the waves. I couldn't just let you leave like that." She walked closer, stopping a few feet away. She looked so small, wrapped in her coat, her hands shoved into her pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. There was a desperation in her eyes, a pleading that twisted something inside me, something I didn't want to feel. Anger, hurt, and a sliver of love, buried so deep I could barely recognize it. But then I heard her footsteps, slow, hesitant at first, crunching on the gravel path that led from the parking lot to the beach. I turned, and there she was, silhouetted in the moonlight, her face pale against the darkness. She'd followed me, somehow knowing where I'd be. "What are you doing here?" I asked, the edge in my voice barely restrained. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to be reminded of the things she'd told me just hours before. "I had to come," she said, her voice barely audible above the waves. I couldn't just let you leave like that." She walked closer, stopping a few feet away. She looked so small, wrapped in her coat, her hands shoved into her pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. There was a desperation in her eyes, a pleading that twisted something inside me, something I didn't want to feel. Anger, hurt, and a sliver of love, buried so deep I could barely recognize it. "You had to come?" I laughed bitterly, the sound strange and harsh in the open air. "Jess, you should have thought about that before all of this, before you decided to do what you did." The words came out jagged, ripped from somewhere raw, somewhere I hadn't even realized existed. She flinched, looking down at the sand. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I can't take it back. I know I ruined everything, but I need you to understand. It was never about you. I was angry, I was confused, and I didn't think." "Didn't think," I interrupted, the fury spilling over, uncontrolled. "Jess, you don't just not think your way into something like that. You don't accidentally end up in bed with some stranger, with Emily, with... God, I don't even know how to say it." My voice cracked, and I turned away, staring out at the waves, trying to steady myself. "You betrayed me, Jess. How am I supposed to just understand that?" She took a shaky breath, and I could see the tears glistening in her eyes, but I didn't care, not anymore. She was the one who'd made this choice, who'd shattered us. Whatever pain she felt now, it didn't compare to what was ripping through me. I don't know why I did it," she said finally, her voice choked. "Emily and we were fighting, and I was so angry. She kept pushing me, questioning everything, even us, like she knew me better than I knew myself. And that night I just wanted to forget, to escape from everything. But I never wanted to hurt you. I swear to God it wasn't about you. Not about me." I shook my head, the bitterness bubbling up again. "Jess, do you have any idea what it feels like to hear that? That this didn't mean anything, that it was just some drunken mistake, some way to get back at Emily or whatever twisted thing you thought you needed to prove. And meanwhile, I'm here, left with this This image in my head, this thing I can't erase. It may not have been about me, but now it's all I can think about. She reached out a hand, tentative, as if hoping to bridge the gap between us, but I took a step back. Her face crumpled, and the look in her eyes, devastated, pleading, should have softened something in me, but all I felt was numbness. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice small, broken. "I don't know what to say, what to do to make it right, but please, please believe me when I say that I still love you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't let you walk away without trying." The words hung between us, heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what had happened. She stood there, her face wet with tears, her hands clenched tightly by her sides as if trying to hold herself together. And for a moment, I almost felt it, that pull, that urge to reach out, to take her in my arms and pretend this was just a nightmare, that we could wake up and go back to the way things were. But then I remembered the look in her eyes that night she'd come home, her makeup smudged, her clothes disheveled. I remembered the confession, the details spilling out like acid, burning through everything I thought I knew. And the anger surged up again, fierce and hot, washing over whatever faint hope her words had stirred. "You love me?" I echoed, my voice low and cold. "Is that supposed to mean something now, Jess? Love doesn't fix this. It doesn't erase what you did. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice, and that choice destroyed us." She took a step closer, her face crumpling with the weight of my words, but I held up a hand, stopping her. I couldn't stand to hear it, to feel the pain radiating off her, mixing with my own. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Every time I see you, all I'll think about is that night, about you and Emily, and some random stranger, all of it." The waves crashed louder, their roar filling the silence between us, drowning out the sob that escaped her lips. She stood there, broken, watching me with a desperation that might have moved me once, before all of this. But now, all I felt was a hollow ache, an emptiness where my love for her used to be. I turned back to the ocean, my eyes stinging, as the wind whipped against my face. I didn't know what to do, where to go from here. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to find a way back to the life we'd had, but the wound was too fresh, too deep, and every time I thought about her words, about what she'd done, the hurt resurfaced, sharp and unforgiving. Finally, I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, grounding me. I looked at her one last time, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't do this, Jess. Not now, maybe not ever." Her face fell, the hope draining from her eyes, and she nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back the sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I turned away, letting the darkness swallow her silhouette as I walked down the shore, my footsteps crunching on the sand, each step taking me further from the life I thought I knew, from the woman I thought I loved. The waves continued their relentless rhythm, indifferent to my pain, crashing and receding, washing over the shore, as if to erase every trace of what had been. And as I walked, I knew that no matter how far I went, the weight of her betrayal would follow, etched into me, a scar that time might dull, but would never completely heal. Emily and I met at the tail end of college. She was everything I admired in a person, kind-hearted, spirited, and funny, in a way that kept you on your toes. She had this light that followed her wherever she went, a radiance that drew people in and put them at ease. We were instantly compatible, like two pieces in a puzzle. Our friendship became a relationship, then a commitment, and before I knew it, my life began to center around her. Over the years, we created countless memories, hikes in the mountains, long road trips, midnight talks under starlit skies, and lazy mornings that melted into afternoons. Our lives felt entwined, bound together by an unspoken promise of forever. Our relationship wasn't perfect, of course. We had our share of arguments, and both of us had quirks that annoyed the other. I was often too focused on work, distracted by the next task or deadline, while Emily had a way of getting lost in her own world, her art, and her love for things I didn't always understand. But these things didn't seem to matter. They were just small, passing clouds in the sky of a life we were building together. Things began to change about a year ago. At first, it was subtle, a shadow I couldn't place, like something out of view shifting quietly in the corner of my eye. Emily had started a new job in the city, working at an art studio as a creative consultant. It was a dream opportunity for her, and I was thrilled, but it also meant longer hours, frequent client meetings, and occasional trips out of town. I supported her fully, though sometimes I missed the simpler times when we spent most evenings together. Then there were the health issues she started mentioning. It began with minor discomfort, little things she'd casually bring up at dinner, like an ache or a pain here and there. I suggested she see a doctor, and eventually she agreed, though she seemed oddly reluctant about it. That's when she found Dr. Marcus Stanton. Dr. Stanton was a specialist, a proctologist she'd been referred to by her general doctor. At first I thought nothing of it. I was just relieved she was finally getting some answers, but something about the way she talked about him began to gnaw at me. She mentioned him more than I expected, always in passing, but with a kind of excitement that felt different. It wasn't exactly obvious, nothing I could point to directly, but she would bring up how kind he was, how he'd gone above and beyond to make her comfortable during a typically uncomfortable appointment. A feeling crept in that I tried to ignore. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just paranoia, but the small signs kept piling up. Emily's schedule changed, appointments that lasted longer than expected, canceled dates with vague excuses, the occasional guarded look on her face when she checked her phone. And while I wanted to believe these were all normal changes, my gut told me otherwise. One evening, we were sitting on the couch, a familiar scene that felt different somehow. She was on her phone, scrolling through something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was elsewhere. "Everything okay?" I asked, hoping I was wrong. She looked up, her smile a bit forced. "Yeah, of course," she replied, putting her phone aside. But she looked at me like she was searching for something, a hint of guilt flashing across her face before she pushed it away with a laugh. "Are you sure? You've just been a little distant," I pressed, trying to sound casual. "Oh, come on," she said, nudging my shoulder. "I think you're the one who's been a bit preoccupied lately, always working, aren't you?" I let it go, but that night, as she drifted off to sleep beside me, my mind raced. Could there really be something going on, or was I losing myself in suspicion? I tried to shake off the doubt, convincing myself that our relationship was solid, built on years of trust. But deep down, I knew that something was slipping further away with every unexplained message, every late appointment, and every moment she turned her face from mine. In the weeks that followed, Emily's distance became more noticeable, but so did her energy. She was glowing, in a way that both delighted and worried me. Her laughter had a newfound ease, her eyes sparkled with a hidden warmth. Yet I felt on the outside of it all, unable to join her in whatever secret happiness she seemed to have found. When I would ask her about her day, she'd offer vague responses, brushing over details that once would have sparked entire conversations. Our connection felt brittle, like it might break if I pushed too hard. One night, we were at a dinner with some friends. As everyone chatted, I caught Emily looking at her phone, her eyes flicking over a message with a slight, barely there smile. She slipped the phone back into her bag quickly when she noticed me watching. I asked myself why I even cared. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something. That night after we got home, I gathered up the courage to talk to her. I tried to keep my voice steady, calm. "Emily," I began, "do you feel like, I don't know, maybe we've been drifting apart?" She looked at me, surprised, and hesitated before answering. "What makes you say that?" she replied, her tone more guarded than I'd expected. "I don't know, it's just, you're different lately." I wanted to sound gentle, but the words came out too fast, too loaded. I could see her walls going up, a flicker of something defensive in her eyes. She shrugged it off, telling me I was overthinking things. But something in her tone felt dismissive, like she was shutting the door on a conversation she didn't want to have. She kissed me on the cheek and turned over to sleep, leaving me lying awake, thoughts swirling in the dark. Over the following days, I noticed a growing distance between us. Emily was more evasive, more guarded with her phone, and I'd started catching her sneaking glances at messages or quickly closing apps when I came near. One afternoon, I decided to ask her about her doctor appointments, trying to sound casual. "How are things going with Dr. Stanton? Are you feeling any better?" "Oh, yeah," she replied, a little too quickly. "He's really thorough. It's just, slow progress." Her tone seemed off, but I didn't push it further. The way she responded was somehow both reassuring and unsettling, like she was trying too hard to make it sound casual. Then, one evening, we went out for dinner. She was in high spirits, laughing and chatting, but something felt off. After she excused herself to use the restroom, her phone, which was sitting on the table, buzzed with a notification. I glanced down, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw Dr. Stanton's name flash on the screen. The message preview read, "Can't wait for our next app," before the text cut off. My stomach twisted, and my mind started racing. Could it really be what I was beginning to suspect? I knew I shouldn't assume the worst, but after all the little clues, it was hard to ignore. When she came back, she noticed me looking at her phone and quickly put it away. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she brushed off my questioning glance with a strained smile. "What's up?" she asked, a little too brightly. "Nothing," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "I just thought I saw a message pop up from Dr. Stanton." She laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Oh, it's just follow-up stuff. They're really on top of things at the clinic." The explanation sounded thin, but I nodded, trying to keep my suspicions at bay. Yet, as the night went on, I couldn't help but feel like there was an invisible wall between us, one that I couldn't break through no matter how hard I tried. In the days that followed, I grew increasingly uneasy. My mind was a storm of questions and doubts, twisting over every detail, every look, every word. One day, I came home early from work, hoping to surprise her, but as I walked into the apartment, I found her on the phone, laughing softly. She didn't notice me right away, and as I stood there listening, my heart dropped. "Yes, I'll see you then. Just text me the details. I'll make it work somehow," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness that I hadn't heard in a long time. When she noticed me standing there, her face went pale. She quickly ended the call, stammering something about it being a friend from her art class. But her expression told me otherwise, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was hearing the echoes of something I wasn't meant to know. That night, I lay awake beside her, feeling the distance between us growing, an invisible chasm I couldn't bridge. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence kept piling up, piece by piece, until it felt undeniable. The days that followed were marked by a tension I could feel in my bones. Emily seemed to sense it, too. She grew quieter around me, more evasive, and often found excuses to leave the house or busy herself with something. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but part of me feared what I might uncover if I pushed too hard. It was as if our entire relationship hung in the balance, balanced on a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. Then, one Friday evening, I came home late after an exhausting day at work, hoping to unwind with a quiet evening together. But when I stepped inside, the apartment was empty. There was no note, no text from Emily about where she'd gone. I checked my phone for any messages, but there was nothing. I paced the apartment, trying to keep my thoughts in check, but as the hours passed, my patience wore thin. By the time she finally walked in around midnight, I was ready to confront her. She looked startled to see me waiting, her eyes widening as if she'd been caught off guard. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the anger simmering just below the surface. "Oh, I went out with some friends," she stammered, avoiding my gaze. "I told you, didn't I?" "No, you didn't," I replied, crossing my arms. "You've been gone for hours, Emily. What's going on?" She bit her lip, her eyes darting away. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think you do," I said, my voice hardening. "I've seen the messages, Emily. I know you've been seeing Dr. Stanton outside of your appointments. Don't lie to me." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, there was only silence between us, a heavy, suffocating silence that filled the room like a dark cloud. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you." My heart sank as the truth finally hit me. It was real. All my suspicions, all the little signs I'd tried to ignore, they had all led to this moment. I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness, a betrayal so deep that it felt like a physical wound. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "A few months," she admitted. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, I swear. It just happened." "It just happened," I repeated, feeling a surge of anger. "You lied to me, Emily. You lied every time you went to see him, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine." "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I've made a terrible mistake. I don't know how to make it right." The anger in me simmered, but beneath it was a hollow ache, a realization that the life we'd built together had been shattered. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could ever forgive her for what she'd done. Maybe it's best if we take some time apart," I finally said, my voice heavy with resignation. She looked up, panic flashing in her eyes. "Please don't say that. I love you. I swear I do. I made a horrible mistake, but I want to make it right. I'll do anything to fix this." But I wasn't sure if it could be fixed. The betrayal ran too deep, a wound that wouldn't heal with just an apology. I stood there, feeling a mixture of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Our relationship, our future, everything we'd shared, it all felt tainted, irreparably damaged by her actions. "I need time," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I need to figure out what I want, what we both want." She nodded, wiping away her tears. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll give you the space you need. Just, please, know that I love you." With that, I walked out of the apartment, leaving behind the life we'd built together, unsure if I'd ever be able to come back.